Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kurt Bailey. I'm a partner with Booz and Company, and we're going to talk about cost reduction. For those of you in the back, you can either stay there, or if you like, you can move up. But I also have some written materials since the slides, a couple of them have some fine print. So why don't I just sort of pass these out a bit. If you want one, take them. If you don't want it, take it anyway and leave it in a chair. Because they're not going on the airplane. So thank you all for coming. You know, the 3:40 slot on a Friday afternoon, I was joking with my spouse. I said, boy, it's going to be me and the crickets. So the fact that anyone showed up, thank you. All right. And I'll just put these here. Thank you, sir. And for the next 40 minutes, we'll talk about cost reduction. Clearly, I have something to say. But it doesn't need to be just me, and if you all would like to ask questions, interrupt, please do so at any point, during what hopefully will be a bit of a conversation. I have a tendency to move around a little bit, and hopefully that won't be too distracting. I apologize, but that's just sort of who I am. I'm, as I said, a partner with Booz and Company. Booz and Company is a consulting firm. We're a global firm. We do about $1.3 billion in business annually, and about a third of that in the United States, of which a third is in healthcare. And we have a business serving life sciences companies, health insurers, and we do a lot of work setting the strategic agenda, solving complex problems for hospitals, health systems, physician groups, and other health services organizations like home care, retail pharmacy, diagnostic labs, and so forth. Okay? And that is the only commercial you're going to get today. All right? Okay. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Okay. Let's do it like this. Okay. So today we're going to cover three things. The context for large-scale cost reduction, why we at our firm at least believe that the time is now. We'll also speak a little bit about what makes that really difficult to do, uniquely so in healthcare, and then talk a little bit about what we have found to be successful approaches, by no means the only approaches that work, but what we have found over the years, both in healthcare but also outside of healthcare, to be good ways to get large-scale costs out of organizations. Uh-oh. The primary reason that we believe cost reduction has to start to come out now is because at some point we're going to see severe contraction in reimbursement. And reimbursement is in some ways very unique to your particular circumstance as a hospital executive, a health system executive, because of your market, because of your payer mix, because of the services you offer. All of this is localized, but at the end of the day, we think that the kind of reductions we're going to see in reimbursement over time is a step change. It's not small, it's not incremental, but it's going to be somewhere north of 10%. And north of 10% off the top line is debilitating for many, many institutions. And if it drops any lower than that, it's debilitating for the vast majority. So one reason to start thinking about cost reduction now is because the reimbursements are going to contract. And when they do contract, you may or may not have, we believe, the lead time needed to put in a thoughtful cost reduction program to stay ahead of that contraction. And instead, you may find that either you lag behind it and you start to have cost problems, or you're forced to do a very reactive program. And reactive cost reduction programs come at real penalties, which we can talk about in a bit. Boy, this thing's going to challenge me all afternoon. Okay, so one reason is the reimbursement, but that's not the only reason. There's a few other reasons as well around market pressures. Costs are going to become increasingly more transparent, and so you'll be expected to reveal what your cost structure is, what costs are of different types, and the ability to use that as an advantage, both in terms of having an advantage cost structure, but also to make the argument that you're continuing to improve those costs over time will ultimately benefit you both with consumers but ultimately with payers. The other reason is that we're in a period of large-scale investment for many hospitals, investments in technology, investments in infrastructure, but also investments in building capabilities that may not be funded by CapEx, but have to be funded by OpEx. And these are capabilities that allow you to build the infrastructure needed to take care, for example, of populations. And that requires a set of capabilities many systems don't have. They have to be paid for on a recurring basis in addition to the upfront costs of setting it up. And if costs, therefore, don't come out on a recurring basis in some part of the organization, it's very difficult to fund recurring costs in other part of the organization, which are all intended to eventually drive medical value. Okay. The other issue is that reactive cost cutting, when you get behind the curve and you have to do something quickly to keep yourself out of hot water, is very wrenching for an organization. In healthcare, we are predominantly a labor-based model. Labor costs are 60-odd% or so of the typical cost structure. And so if you're going to cut your costs, you're going to cut into labor. And we are a empathetic, community-oriented industry that really doesn't like to have to take labor costs out unless we absolutely have to. If you delay in an environment of contracting reimbursements to start a cost reduction program, you are likely to be forced into the reactive mode. If you start now to get cost out, then you can provide a gentler glide slope, a safety net, if you will, for the workforce that will end up being surplus potentially from the cost program and make it so they have a safer landing. By doing that, not only is it the decent thing to do, but it creates an environment where, frankly, senior leadership, your boards, your executive teams, and middle management find cost reduction a lot more palatable. When we talk to folks around the country about taking costs out, there's genuine, honest concern about the impact it has on people's livelihood. And this is a way to still do the hard work, still make the tough decisions to get cost out, but do it in a way that is much more humane and allows folks to transition out of organizations at something closer to their own timeline rather than one that you force upon them. Okay. The other issue is that the third and the fourth is that cost reduction can be a powerful means of driving operational improvement. Now, the objective function may be to get cost out, but you could change that objective function. You could make it patient satisfaction. You could make it cycle time or throughput. The action needed to redesign the work of an organization so that it's fundamentally more efficient is highly similar in nature, whether you're getting costs out, efficiency, whether you're improving throughput, which tends to be speed, or whether you're bettering quality, whether it's clinical or whether it's service quality, meaning the patient experience. And so when you do a large-scale cost program, it's actually a terrific way to build a capability for improvement over time. And it's a nice way to begin a continuous improvement capability for your organizations. Any thoughts or comments about why now? Nope? Okay. In the past, we really haven't been very good at this. The traditional approaches to getting cost out are very tactical, and they yield pretty modest results. So we'll do things like beat up the vendors a little bit. We'll tighten down on our nursing ratios. We're going to squeeze some productivity out. Might do some clipping of discretionary spend like travel and training and so on. And that's how we make budget. But our own reports on whether that works is that it doesn't 75% or more of the time. So our historical way of getting cost out, we believe, if you believe the surveys, isn't effective. And by the way, the escalation of healthcare costs in the United States does seem to indicate that's true. So a different approach is required. It's an approach, though, that we're not necessarily knowledgeable about. If you think about redesigning the way care gets delivered, redesigning the way internal services get delivered to make them more efficient in an organization, and the folks who actually run those activities today, it's, for example, clinicians. So a pharmacy director is probably a pharmacist. And that individual probably has no experience in industrial engineering. They probably have no coursework in operations management. They haven't had to do large-scale process redesign or re-engineering work before because they're a pharmacist. And so the skills that we have in delivering care have tended to be biased toward administration and clinical activities and not around operational improvement. Not in the same way that other industries see that as a core competency and the way in which they steadily improve their cost profile over time. And in fact, other industries made cost takeout a core competency. And they routinely launch waves of cost reduction as industries, but also as companies. And there's some examples here. Now, healthcare has been dabbling with some methodologies, Lean, Six Sigma probably being the one that folks are most familiar with. And those are very powerful methodologies. They can be very effective. They're also very slow. And so if you think about Virginia Mason and when they started their Lean journey, which has really been extraordinary, if you believe that reimbursement will contract, if you believe your cost structure is going to need adjusting, following a 10-year Lean journey is simply too long. And an approach that brings many of those operational improvement concepts needs to somehow get compressed down into a timeline that fits what is a reality for many hospitals in the U.S. Okay? Now, we firmly believe, I am completely convinced, that you can get 15 to 20% out of your typical acute care facility. And that is not going to affect patient care in a negative way. It will not affect the patient experience, family experience in a negative way. This is simply by doing the work smarter. And the reason for this, at least my opinion, is that healthcare has been shielded from the competitive forces that require other industries to steadily march down that cost curve. If you think about consumer products, if you think about airline travel, automobiles, steadily those products get engineering content built into them, right? So your car today is a whole lot more capable, safer, faster, et cetera, than a car of yesterday. But the cost of actually producing that content goes down over time. And that's, of course, a great benefit of our economy. But healthcare hasn't gone through those waves of re-engineering, those waves of cost-based innovation. We haven't really had to. And so while on the one hand, if your glass is half full, it's we're too expensive. Or wait, no, if your glass is half empty, we're too expensive. If your glass is half full, there's a ton of opportunity. And we see that in our work time and time again. We also see that these are not programs that require large-scale capital investments, and they're not programs that require big IT system solutions. They are simply redesigning how the work of the organization is done so that it's done more efficiently than it was previously. Okay? Any thoughts or comments about that? That was a bit of an editorial. No? Okay. Now, in the past, the approach that's typically been used has been pretty tactical, and it gets 3 to 7% savings, usually. And that's not bad, and many of you have probably already done these things. And it's focusing in on department budgets, it's focusing in on cost pools like supplies, and it's trying to squeeze a little bit out. And that is necessary to do. Unfortunately, what it doesn't do is it doesn't attack the drivers of those costs, the decisions that have been made and how the operations have been designed that result in your cost structure. And because you don't go after those decisions, not you, but one doesn't go after those decisions, one can't make significant adjustments in the cost structure. Furthermore, tactical approaches tend to be pretty siloed, and it doesn't reflect the interdependency that we see across departments, across activities within an acute care facility, and so you lose some opportunity there as well. Transformational cost reduction, you set a bigger goal, 15%. Not in the first year, but over some definable time period. And you emphasize getting cost out of the whole thing in an integrated manner so that the interdependencies between departments are all fully reflected, so that the teams work together, so that they're able to benefit from the cross-pollination of the ideas. And you focus on getting to those decisions that cause the cost structure that we have today. The framework that we use, oops, I'm going to skip ahead. The framework that we use to talk about cost drivers, those decisions that shape your cost structure, is this one here. We think it has 4 layers. there's the decisions around what we do. And you don't make those very often. What do we do in an acute care facility? You make those pretty infrequently. But choosing what you do in the facility, what services you offer, for example, has a profound effect on your cost structure. Then there's the decision around, well, how and where do we do it? And this is your asset base. How many ORs are we going to have? How many facilities are we going to have if we're a multi-facility system? Where are we going to put the ambulatory care? Where are we going to position the ancillaries? Are they going to be on campus, off campus, in a facility, not in a facility, and so forth? And that's the structural set of decisions that drive your cost structure at that level, coupled with decisions to outsource, as well as decisions on technology. Then you go down to what we call the systemic level, which is around process. It's around use of automation. It's around metrics, organizational structure. And then you go down to the last level, the realized level, which is how much do we pay people, what's the unit price with our vendors, and frankly, what I have seen in the past is some pretty absurd things around optimizing the chicken consumption per patient. That's a real example. And if you're down here at the realized level, worried about the chicken consumption per patient, you're probably not going to get enough cost out. One has to then start up here if you want to hit 15 to 20% and move down. But that's also the most difficult place to start, and it's also what takes the longest. But it's a way of now tying decisions to the effect on costs and being able to build a series of alternative choices. We made this before, it drove our costs like this. Let's make a new choice. How will it drive our costs in the future so that you can get the costs out? Now, how you scope the program will determine how much cost you can get out. On the far left, it's a focus on the department. Focus on a nursing unit, focus on the lab, focus on an internal, an administrative function like HR. And if you're at that level and you're just focusing simply on that function, the range of savings is pretty narrow because you don't have as many degrees of freedom. Now if you expand it out to the entirety of the facility, there's a broader range of choices you can make in order to redesign those operations, and that's where you get to somewhere around 15%. And then if you layer in shared services, so that's taking administrative functions and some clinical support functions and finding a way to scale those across multiple facilities, scale those across your inpatient and your ambulatory locations and so on, then there's another tranche of savings you can get. And then when you start to integrate across the system and behave truly as an integrated system, you get another slice and so on. And so when you think, if you do, think about building a program to get cost out of your institution, it's worth thinking about the scope early. Because if you do scope it here, you will probably get something like that. But if you scope it over here, the opportunities get much bigger. The difficulty of getting cost out, though, is twofold. And getting cost out of healthcare is hard. And there's a technical challenge, and then there's an emotional challenge. And I would argue the emotional challenge is the harder one. The technical challenge is about the analytics. It's about scoping it right. It's about the cost drivers. It's about really understanding all of the industrial engineering and so forth around delivery of care. And healthcare is complicated, and that's not easy to do. But it's doable. Smart people, well-led, can do that work. The emotional challenge, though, is something else. And this is the blockage that we see very often in leaders to taking out costs in healthcare. And it happens both with senior leadership teams, where getting consensus on building a cost reduction program, which will result in employees coming out of the organization, can be very, very hard. But it also exists at the middle management level. And the quandary is that if you're going to get good technical analysis over here, where you're really understanding how things work today and how they can work differently in the future, middle management has to be in the middle of that. They're actually the only ones that know. And even they don't know it as well as they would think they do. And so they need to go through a bit of a journey of discovery in order to help create a cost reduction program that'll work. But middle management doesn't really want to do it because they're vested in the status quo, and it could actually affect them. It could affect their friends. I mean, in some instances, it affects family because the way healthcare is, because they're going to be designing changes to the operation that result in job loss. And everyone knows this when you go talk about cost. There's no way to create a euphemism around it. Everyone knows it as soon as you say it. Say the word cost, reduction, and folks say job loss. I don't want to do that. And so you have to create an environment where middle and senior management can do good work and support a program. You have to create an emotional structure for them that allows them to do it. And that's a process. And if you skip the process, folks will undermine a cost reduction program in 1,000 different ways that you can never get control of. And that's not an opinion, that's just empirically true. And it is very true in healthcare, but it's actually true in some other industries as well. Okay? Any thoughts about the technical and the emotional? Okay. So I won't read through the slide, but there's lots of opportunities in healthcare. The savings are there. Even stuff that we think we do well, like matching our labor to our true demand, when you really get down to demand and how it fluctuates, even there we don't always do it well. And that's something that healthcare has been working on for a long time. But there's also savings in restructuring the overhead functions. If you're a system and you operate in multiple markets, multiple facilities, and so on, in most other industries you would have centralized your overhead functions like HR, IT, finance, and so forth. Some of those would have gone into the corporate core, some of them would have gone into a shared service, and then you'd have some embedded in your local businesses. And in healthcare, for the most part, we haven't done that yet. We've done it partially. Sometimes when we do it, we rearrange the lines and boxes, but we don't redesign the underlying processes. And so even though we've got a new org structure, we don't actually have any efficiencies. So there's the overhead. Standardization of care in order to eliminate unnecessary clinical variation and unnecessary clinical utilization. There's a lot written about it. I think most folks here are very familiar with it. But we're just at the beginning of figuring out ways to root that out. And so a programmatic approach to find those types of costs. And so on and so forth. And I won't read through that. But the opportunities are there. Oftentimes, though, when we see clients that have had a cost reduction program before, the level of analysis is pretty thin. If you're going to have a program, if you believe that cost reduction is hard, and if you believe it can be undermined over time by people who don't want to do it, and if you believe you have to have a process in place that convinces them to do it, then you have to have really sound analytics to prove to them that the operational changes we're talking about are worth doing and they'll work. Because people are smart. And without that underlying detail, they simply won't intuitively say, okay, I get it. Yeah, that really is inefficient. And most of the time, when folks are confronted with facts and data, even if it brings them to a conclusion they really didn't want to get to, they'll accept it, and they'll do it. Because we want to do the right thing, and that's very, very true, I think, in the environments which we work. People want to do the right thing. But you have to have the facts and data, and lots of it. And then you have to make sure the senior leaders get a chance to see all those facts, to go through all that data. And oftentimes what we do is we drag leadership teams through a day or a day and a half of reviewing literally 100 different opportunities across a single facility in detail, laboriously. Because once they've gone through that and they've accepted it, then they as leaders will tend to drive it much better than if you haven't. It's not enough to feed it into a budget. You have to convince people intellectually and emotionally that this is doable. Okay, typical barriers to cost reduction. Senior leaders, we got too much going on. We've got an EMR implementation. We're thinking about doing an acquisition. We just brought in a new group. We're too busy. Sometimes senior leaders are pretty cynical, even though they themselves are the ones suggesting the program for cost takeout. And in the back of their minds, they're saying, this is just going to be a haircut. And we're going to say we're going to have a big program, but the reality is we're just going to take 5% out of the budget this year, 5% next year. And I, as a functional leader, will be left holding the bag because the operational work, the operational changes haven't been done so those costs truly come out. Cost reduction necessarily has to involve senior or middle managers, as I mentioned. They have to be part of the teams that do this work, but they don't really want to do it. And they're worried that if they participate in a cost reduction program that isn't run by their boss, so you take a middle manager out of their chain of command and you say work on a special project, work on a special team on getting cost out of the organization through operational redesign, well, they don't want to suggest any ideas that might get their boss upset. So they're going to be conservative. They don't want to suggest any ideas that could cause, as I mentioned, their friends or their colleagues to be impacted. People lose their jobs because of ideas that they proved out. And they don't want to put their own job at risk. Will I have a job when I'm done with this work? So you don't get a lot of volunteers right off the bat for this kind of work. And then middle managers won't believe senior leaders will see a program through. Cynicism in that it'll not really be completed as originally intended. It'll devolve to a haircut. It'll devolve to just budget decrements. It won't be redesigned. Middle managers often just believe there's no more room in their department. And again, this goes back to the fact that they really don't have the skills in industrial engineering and process redesign and so forth to know when there's excess. And so these obstacles are ones we commonly confront. And so the program has to be structured so you can systematically get through each one, and you may have others for your organization that are slightly different. But the process of undertaking this needs to address each one very explicitly. So what we suggest is that if you're thinking about a program like this, the CEO needs to set the goal. And the goal should be sizable. It should be a goal that makes everyone go, whoa, okay, that's different. 15 to 20% is a good one. People seem to like that. Even better if it's reported to the board, because reporting it to the board in advance of doing it is a commitment device. And the board will then subsequently ask senior leaders, hey, how are you doing on that 15 to 20% you said you were going to come out? Management team has to be very visibly on board, communicate actively in support of a program like this, fully endorse it, no naysaying. Anything other than that slowly starts to dilute the power of the program. And it's a program that inertia is pushing against its success. And so we're fighting against that inertia. As I mentioned, got to get middle management involved. How do you get them involved? You pull them out of their day jobs for a while, take them out of their chain of command, put them in a separate special project team, create teams that are cross-functional in nature, create teams with a mix of people who are deep subject matter expertise but also critical thinkers, create teams who have knowledge about the scope of the work of that particular team. Say it's a team that's going to go ahead and work on peri-op. Well, have some people in there from finance, have some people in there from the ancillaries, have some people in there from IT doing cost work in peri-op. And the cross-fertilization of ideas that happens is very surprising, but it's also very powerful because you get a lot of fresh thinking from people within your own organization. When these programs are finished with the first phase, they produce a portfolio of opportunities. Good ideas, vetted by senior leaders, vetted by middle managers, richly substantiated with facts and data. People believe they're true. Now, you're going to have the option of when to decide to execute those. And if you've got, say, 100 of these ideas that you believe are going to bear fruit, and then those are going to result in surplus labor. Now, it'll result in non-labor costs coming out too, and I don't mean to overemphasize the labor component, but that is the barrier that we're struggling with this process. So as the labor would come out from this progressive implementation of these ideas, you have the choice as leaders when that happens. It doesn't have to happen as soon as the operational fix is made. And so a human capital plan allows you to decide how that labor is going to come out, because it can come out through attrition. You can put a hiring freeze in place, do the operational redesign work, and as the efficiency improves, instead of people coming out of the workforce in a forced way, they come out through attrition. Similarly, a human capital plan that allows you to move employees laterally across the organization, so that if you're reducing labor over here because of redesign, but you're growing over here, internal employees have visibility to those opportunities, they're given preference, and you're able to move people laterally. The human capital plan also ensures that you don't do things like layoffs before Christmas. And everyone would imagine that never happens, but it actually does. And so it's all the way to take the operational work, put a human capital overlay in order to make for, in order to treat the workforce decently. Okay, structured three-phase process: diagnostic, detailed design, implementation. It's pretty standard. And you create this journey of discovery so that the teams that do this work together, particularly the diagnostic work, come to see the opportunity for themselves. And what you'll notice is that a light bulb goes on many times. And they start to understand how the operations of an acute care facility or ambulatory or whatever, how they really work. And it actually changes how they think. And it produces critical thinking. It improves their critical thinking skills in ways that are pretty surprising. And when you do that, you're growing the capacity of the organization to do more of this work over time. Physicians, they're either going to be part of the solution or they're going to be part of the problem. So involve the physicians up front, put them on the teams. If you have a lot of affiliated physicians, pay them. It's worth it. They bring an amazing amount of experience. But if you also don't get a lot of physician engagement up front, then they too will undermine on the back end. A couple years ago, if you'd asked me whether physicians would willingly participate in something like this, I would have probably said, no, probably not. But it has changed dramatically. And my experience over the last several years has been uniformly positive, and getting physicians involved in these efforts make them much more powerful. They're wonderful contributors, and it works really well. We talked about the rigorous substantiation bottoms up. We talked about building the capacity for continuous improvement. And the last one is you have to manage the program almost like you would manage the design and construction of a brand new 500-bed acute care facility. You would have a lot of program management around that because that's a huge capital investment. Well, a cost reduction program that takes 15 to 20% off of a multi-million-dollar cost base is a lot of value. And that value has to be safeguarded through really strong informed program management. So you create a program management office, staff it up, put the tools in place, and carefully manage at the senior leadership level to ensure that you get both results that are on strategy, people make the changes that you were asking them to change in the operations, but also produce the effect that you intended. The costs really do come out. Okay. So we've got about 6 minutes left, and this is a collection of critical success factors. We put this, I think Becker's published this a couple of months ago or so. If you are going to start something like this, don't underestimate the scope. It's kind of like doing a complete, if you've ever done a major overhaul of your house, it's kind of like that. So respect the level of effort it's going to require and give it that due attention. It's going to take several years for this to get done, and sustaining the attention for that period of time is hard, but you have to do it. And the cost reduction program has to be baked into how leaders manage every day. Set aggressive targets. A word on benchmarking. Benchmarking, healthcare loves benchmarking. I've worked in a lot of different industries. I didn't start out in healthcare. I've done cost reduction in most sectors of the economy. And healthcare is the only one that uses benchmarks to the level at which we do. Only one. Absolutely unique. To me, benchmarking performance of peers in an industry that has failed to control costs when we expect to see declining reimbursement in the future isn't logical. I just can't, I would not want to argue that case. So it's fine if you want to use benchmarks to set some broad targets, but my personal suggestion is set a target based on what your market reality is going to be, what you think is going to happen to reimbursement, what dollars you think you need to invest, how you're going to free up that, how much cash you're going to need, and set a big target. I would not rely on the benchmarks for any of the detailed work because they're too easy for people to quibble about, and benchmarks don't tell you what to change. They only tell you that someone else is reporting different performance than you are. And there's a lot of arguments about whether the data is right, is it apples to apples, and so forth. And that time could be better spent figuring out what truly are we going to change and how we do our work every day. As leaders, set the example by thinking bold. Your first reaction to a really difficult, aggressive, audacious plan to change the operation, get costs out should be yes, not no. Then make sure that the work substantiates it so that yes is a good decision, but you set the example of defaulting to yes rather than defaulting to no, even when it involves tough, complicated decisions. Involve the docs. Create the program office. Do it early. Have the human capital plan. Bake the cost reduction objectives into the management business objectives of the senior leadership team and of middle management. And that's tricky in healthcare because many leaders don't have variable comp, so you can't necessarily tie it to their bonus, or if you do have variable comp, it oftentimes is very low. But even so, make it so it's in how they get assessed, and that's particularly important for senior leaders that get reviewed by the board. Okay. Communicate, communicate, communicate. As soon as you know something, as long as I mean, there's some judgment here about when you communicate things around cost reduction, but default to being open and honest and often, because nothing hurts morale worse than darkness and rumor when people are scared. And cost reduction is scary for the workforce. I've seen wonderful examples of video clips by senior leaders, lots of email, town halls, and once you get out actively to communicate cost reduction, if you do it enough with enough honesty and bravery, it takes a lot of the power out of it, particularly if you've got a plan in place that you've communicated to the organization about how you're going to ensure that folks are treated decently if their position is surplus. And then finally, just execute, 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 just like you would execute a very expensive capital project, just like you would execute the installation of an EMR. Put this in the same category. Okay. So that's all my comments for today. I'm happy to take questions, comments, thoughts, critiques. Sir?
When you think about single-site providers, a lot of what you have laid out, we're a single hospital facility.
Yeah.
What would be the top 2 or 3 labor productivity savings in your experience?
It does vary. We often see a lot of excess in the ancillaries. And we often see excess in departments where there's been demand drops, somewhat sustained demand drops, and they haven't adapted yet. So that could be in peri-op, it could be but also it could be in just your nursing units if you've seen drop in demand over time. And if the nursing units haven't been restructured yet, then oftentimes there's excess there. But in general, somewhat surprisingly, given the focus we have on productivity metrics, there's not always a really good match between, no kidding, how many people do we have there on the day, and what is the volume of work on the day. And if you get down to that level of detail, by day, by hour, by person, you actually don't see it match up very well. Other thoughts or comments or questions? Okay, I think I'm all that stands between you and the end of the day. So I think I'm done. Oh, is there one more? Oh, I'm sorry, there's one more. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate your time today.